Professor John is absolutely right. You know, humans have been around. I would agree. I like the 200,000 year mark as just a convenient, relatively uncontroversial mark for like beginning of whoever we are. And we have been around during periods of extraordinary change in climate. So the existence of humanity on the planet when climate change has happened is not new. But one of the things that is definitely weird is that in recent times, and when I say recent, I'm talking, you know, within the past 10,000 years, climate's got pretty stable relative to what it was before. So this is just showing you over some of that time period. I mean, this is going back to about 50,000 years. But it's showing you the tremendous temperature variation during the times that Professor John was talking about. Some of those times with the glaciations and the ice ages. But then when we get to about 10,000 years ago, we get an increase in temperature, but also a tremendous stabilization of temperature. And so, in the scheme of things, that's a little bit weird. And that a lot of well, as an archaeologist, I like to think of human history going back to 3 million years ago, because that's when the first artifacts are dated to. So I like to think in those broad scales. So for human history, we've dealt with climate change, but the history that I think most people think about is the more, in my mind, recent history, like 5,000 years ago. And that's the era of, you know, whatever you'd call them, civilizations, complex societies, but those, like what we live in today, you know, really populous, societally interdependent, you know, societies or whatever, communities. But those are, you know, restricted to the really, really recent time period. So, absolutely, humans have dealt with climate change, but not the kind of humans and the settings and situations we live in today. And that's why the climate change and the global warming we're facing now is so troubling. You know, because humans have dealt with it, but civilizations haven't dealt with it. You know, we definitely live in a civilization, and it is and can have dire consequences for a civilization going forward. So I wanted to just start off with that basic kind of characteristic, the coincidence of civilizations with a warmer, relatively stable temperature. But what I wanted to do now, and it might not be exactly what Professor John was talking about, but I want to talk about a couple case studies of, during this time, you know, you can still see, in the past, at 10,000 years or so, there's still climate change. You know, and I want to talk about a couple case studies I'm pretty familiar with to look at how peoples have dealt with them, both in positive and negative ways. And it definitely doesn't give us a recipe for how to go forward, like a checklist, so if we do this and this, but it does give you some big picture lessons of kind of what's possible for humanity in dealing with some real challenges. But I will move on. Okay, this is a map of the American Southwest and Northwest Mexico. It's an area that I went to grad school out there, so I've got some experience in this part of the world. It's the archaeology I probably know best. And it's a really great area because for archaeologists, you've got really good preservation because of its arid climate. You've got pretty good time control. And what I mean by that is because of the dating that's been done at these sites. I mean, these folks that I'm going to talk about, these ancient peoples, the ancestors of Native Americans of that region, they didn't have written records, so we don't have dates. So we have to rely on things like tree ring dating is a really important one, or radiocarbon dating. But the tree ring dating in particular has allowed us to get a really fine-grained chronology of change in this area. So it's a great laboratory for archaeology, you know, in that we've got a good control of time, lots of archaeological resources because of the preservation of with the dry, arid climate, and fascinating changing societies that we have evidence for. And so I'm going to briefly talk, and I don't have a ton of slides, but I just want to talk briefly about 2, maybe 3 case studies where ancient peoples faced really challenging climate change. Usually it was droughts, extended droughts, that required some kind of social response in the face of that. So, let me see, where do I want to start? I think I'll start up north, which is what's labeled up there the Ancestral Pueblo. If you've seen any images, if you've seen one image, I should say, of an archaeological site in New Mexico or Colorado, it's probably from up there. It's undoubted. It's the famous archaeological remains of this area. We refer to it as Ancestral Pueblo because there's real clear evidence that living Pueblo peoples, the Zuni, the Hopi, a number of other folks, that their ancestors were responsible for the remains that we found. But in particular, it was changing over time. And one of the really interesting periods is, if you can see up right at the Four Corners area, where the 4 modern states come together, during the 1200s, that was a pretty, relative to the time, populated area. It was mostly like small villages or relatively isolated, like farmstead, hamlets, extended family farms, basically. And it was people doing farming, corn, beans and squash and other things. Relatively independent. It looks like there wasn't, at the time, a lot of large-scale social connections that were uniting, like at a regional level. But that's kind of the setting, kind of the scene. Beginning in about 1275 to 1299, there was a really, really severe drought that afflicted the area. And by that time, it seems like the population of that area had reached a ceiling, And so we've got a growing population, and now we've got an environment that is not nearly as productive as it was. So what you got in this, there's actually, it's complicated, but 2 main trends that have appeared at this point. Well, what do you think? What's going to happen? Things are really going terribly. There's a lot of people, not a lot of resources around. What are 2 basic responses?
Build a wall.
Oh, build a wall. No, or I'm just even thinking even more basic than that, like fight or flight. And at some level, that's kind of what happened. This time frame has some of the clearest evidence in the American Southwest for violent encounters between folks. Thoroughly burned farmsteads, villages, human remains that clearly suffered some grisly, violent ends. But that wasn't it. That wasn't the only thing that happened. A lot of people did move further south. And really by 1300, much of that Four Corners area was relatively depopulated. I'm sure there were a few folks, and we don't know absolutely everything for sure because it's archaeology, but you definitely see a population movement going to the south. There are other folks in the south already too. So we've got migration coming down, and there's people already there. So again, how do we deal with that? And in this case, a wall wasn't built. In this case, you got another response to this changing social mix. And I'm going to quickly show a couple, this is just a shot of the today's environment in much of that area. It's kind of it's a desert, but it's not the kind of Sahara desert that fills people's heads of, sand dunes and all that. So there is definitely some life there. Oh, this is what I was trying to show you earlier. This is an estimate of populations during that time in that area. It's based on archaeological sites, and it's not perfect, but an estimate of populations showing you that by 1300, looks like folks were pretty much gone. So that's just a recap of some of the stuff that I already mentioned. What I want to talk about now is our archaeological indicators of how people responded in this situation. This here is an image. It's a reconstruction of what's called a Kiva. And this is an important ceremonial, ritual, and kind of like recreational structure for even today's Puebloan peoples. But we find Pueblos going way back. You know, you found Pueblos in that area that I was just talking about during the 1200s, and you find them going even further back. So Pueblos are an old form of like a ritual facility sort of thing. And so they've been important for a long time. They tend to be underground, or they are underground. And some of them can be big, but I would say probably the biggest found might have the square footage of this room. So not terribly big structures. You could get some people in it, you know, a decent amount of people in it, but as we'll come to in a second, not a whole community into it. So this had been the major form of ritual religious architecture. And you know, one social scientific read of religion and ritual is that it's a way to bond people together to create a sense of cohesion and collectiveness. And it does seem that explanation works for part of what we're talking about. But getting back to where I wanted to go, so now we've got a bunch of people coming down, and there are Kivas down in this southern area of the region that I'm talking about here. Folks had Kivas there too. But once you get these big migrations of people coming to the south, you get a different form of ritual or religious facility being focused on and developed. And this doesn't show it exactly. This is a historic shot of I believe, what's called a Kachina Dance at one of the pueblos in northern New Mexico. But villages begin to be established, large villages, with big open plazas in the middle. Now it's like the Alumni Green, as opposed to this room. And so the Alumni Green can accommodate a lot more people than this room. You can bring a lot more folks together. And so the focus of ritual activity now is much bigger and community-wide. And there's other things that suggest this greater focus beyond like the immediate family or the extended family, that a more, a community, a larger community social structure is being built, and that's kind of accommodating some of these newcomers into the area. And so that's another response. So we have climate change. Well, in this case, you know, 25 years of terrible drought directly impacting people's subsistence, livelihood practices. One of the results was, you know, really quite terrifying and frightening violence and conflict. Another result was people fleeing, migrating away, and in some cases, and this is a pretty common pattern in this part of the southern Southwest, or the southern Colorado Plateau where I'm talking about, is the establishment of big villages with plazas. And that's kind of what historic pueblos have looked like. So that historic pueblos, we had more information about actually what was going on in them. You know, pictures, talk to people. And one of the really interesting things about like the ritual taking place here is what's called a Kachina Dance. And Kachinas, to be a member of this religious society, everybody in the village is expected to be a member of that society, where a lot of other ritual societies are exclusive. So it does provide that kind of cohesion, collective focus. And it looks like it originated after climate change. So there was a social response to climate change that seemed to work here. You know, and this is basically the form that Pueblos were living in when the Spanish showed up. You know, and it provided, you know, a fairly resilient and resisting social form for quite a while. I mean, Pueblo peoples are still alive and doing important things today, so they weren't wiped out or anything, but clearly their lives changed dramatically with European colonization at that time. So that's one case study of how, in the northern Southwest, how people dealt with climate change. So climate change was happening, but the social responses, there were many social responses possible. And one in this situation, at least for a couple hundred years, it worked. You know, and you don't see the levels of violence at this time. You don't see like grave remains, human remains that show significant signs of like nutritional stresses or violent ends. So it seems to have worked, adapted in that situation. Let me see. Do we have time? I've got one more. Any questions though? Yeah.
So in their stories or beliefs from this time, did they account for the movement of people into the area and including them? Were there any particular points about that are known?
Yeah. I mean, I know there are stories about coming from the north, peoples coming from the north, and individual clans or lineages have stories about their migrations moving from the north. There's some interesting stories about even going further back, but it's kind of going to take me further afield. But yeah, there is some discussion of people coming down. And the archaeological evidence shows it too, and like looking at like pottery styles, and how people, like how you learn how to make pottery, it's kind of passed down generation to generation. So you start seeing different ways of making pottery at the same village, like new appearances of new pottery that you had seen previously up to the north. So things like that are the archaeological indicators of migration. Okay. Anything else? Okay, moving on. Now a group of people, ancient archaeological society, that is not as famous as the Ancestral Pueblo areas because most of their architecture was made of adobe, dried mud brick. And over 1,000 years, dried mud brick, even in the arid Southwest, will melt away. It doesn't melt completely away, but it makes for, rather than like standing stone structures, it makes for a small pile of dried mud brick, which isn't quite as spectacular. It doesn't make postcards nearly as much. But I want to talk about these folks. Archaeologists call them the Hohokam. It comes from a local native language, meaning those who are gone, those that are all used up, whatever. I'm sure the people themselves didn't call themselves Hohokam. But what's interesting here, unlike Ancestral Pueblo, we call them Ancestral Pueblo because there are living Pueblo peoples that show direct historical cultural connections to these ancient societies. You don't have as clear a connection to the Hohokam. Something else happened in the Hohokam. We don't see that continuous historical trajectory. And ultimately, where I'm going, something bad happened to the Hohokam. They're a case study for how people maybe went away, that it wasn't what we've talked about, it wasn't necessarily fighting, it wasn't fleeing, it was something else that didn't work out in the end. I don't have, let me see, this is an illustration of kind of a Hohokam village at its height. Probably like, let's say, AD 1300 or so. So, big villages, it doesn't come out super clear. Oh, and just before I forget, if you've been to Phoenix or Tucson, that's Hohokam heartland. That's where they were. And so Phoenix, the sprawl that is modern Phoenix, has destroyed most of the archaeological remains of that area, but a lot of information has been gathered about it. And this village here it's actually very near the Sky Harbor Airport in Phoenix. I think it's a real quick exit if you're ever there. A museum dedicated to this. But a big village centered around what we call a platform mound, not a small, but a pretty large earthen mound with, it looks like elite, kind of high-status people living up there, doing things up there, surrounded by neighborhoods of other people living in walled compounds. But one of the things that stands out, because especially if you've been to Phoenix in modern times, unless you're at a golf course, it doesn't look that green. Because one of the things that the Hohokam are famous for was very sophisticated irrigation systems. And that it does seem to be that they made the Phoenix Valley quite lush in growing quite a bit of food. And this comes from an old surveyor's map in the 1920s. A guy mapped all of the evidence of ancient Hohokam canals. So this here is the Salt River, the Gila River's coming down here. You don't need to know, the thing that I just want to stand out is there's a lot of canals coming off the river. Some of them go for, I want to say like 20 kilometers. So not It's definitely not insignificant. You know, it shows pretty sophisticated engineering, understanding of hydrology, because you can't dig a 20-kilometer canal just by saying, dig that canal. You got to follow topography, you got to dig it at the right angles, you know, to make it an effective canal. And then you've got all the administrative apparatus of distributing water to who, when. So really sophisticated infrastructure. That ultimately, though, seems to have led to some of their undoing. Because by the 1400s, there was a series of like droughts and floods, kind of, you know, because if you get too much water coming down, that's a recipe for disaster for irrigation, just as much as too little water coming down. So a lot of climatic instability, and what seems to have happened is they dug their canals further and longer and more. And when you're connected to canals, or when your livelihood is based on canals, it's harder to pick up and move. You've invested. You know, you're tied to the place. So it was harder, like those folks at Mesa, or the Four Corners area, there wasn't quite as much of the likely social, symbolic, and just basic material commitment to the specific plots of land. Where here, there's much more of that investment. You're sunk there. And essentially, it seems like the Hohokam kind of doubled down on irrigation. And it wasn't like some catastrophic disaster where everybody like was wiped out overnight. But it seems like about over 100 years, mortality rates start going up, birth rates start going down. And this is based on analyses of Hohokam cemeteries. Rates of nutritional stress are going up. And so what you see is just it's not, I guess, slow, 100 years is pretty rapid, but a population kind of collapse, implosion. That so by the time the Spanish made their entries up into this area, there were native peoples, but they were living for the most part in scattered, isolated farmsteads. They weren't living around big villages. They weren't digging extensive irrigation canals. It was like, I don't know, it kind of reminds me of certain like post-apocalyptic movies when society's totally gone and then people are just out in the pockets, you know, just kind of a few people scattered across the landscape left behind. So that's kind of, in that case, we've got an example of a group of folks who they, you know, did what made sense to them at the time, but it didn't work out in the end. So, and I think that's where I'll end, unless there are other questions or